A quick few apologies on my part. So the first thing is I'm not feeling 100% today. I'm a bit under the weather. I had a headache this morning. So if at any point I start rambling or stuttering, please forgive me. Second thing is English is not my first language. It's one of the 5 languages I speak. So I request your apology for the accent and any miscommunication, if that may occur. And then what Avi said about the titles and all, I'm none of those things. I'm not an academic. If you've come to listen to an academic, I'm sorry, I am going to disappoint you tremendously. My slideshow is just a poorly organized set of newspaper clippings and cartoons, and that's about all I could put together. But what I am is a very humble student of life and the living, and what I try to do in my teachings is to try and simplify the content into as easily understandable a matter as possible. So, without further ado, I was given this topic, what is possible in humanitarianism, and I would just give the answer. So, the answer is, we wish it would be as straightforward as that, because it would be a very short presentation then. But considering the historical exploitation and the ongoing wealth extraction from the global south, aid from the global north could possibly be viewed as repayment of colonial and neo-colonial debts instead of charity. Is it possible? However. Okay, let's dig in. Let's dig into the history of tropical medicine and aid. This, in a nutshell, is a timeline of how the system of tropical medicine evolved. So initially there was this Western imperial expansion, which included domination of indigenous peoples, of course. Then there was imperial consolidation. This was the time when tropical medicine actually grew, and the idea behind it was to serve the needs of the colonizers rather than the colonized. Then there was the early development phase, which included improving public health as a part of development projects, but the objectives were still not primary, much rather they were secondary to the economic objectives. Then comes the part of decolonization of lands, which means many of the post-colonial countries ended up with independence, and there was a formal end to the imperial rule, followed by a rise in global health. So there was this time of establishment of these transnational multilateral organizations and programs aimed to improve health in low middle income countries. This was a period, of course, from after the Second World War all the way to the 2000s. And now there are calls for a decolonized global health. We'll have a look at to what that means exactly. 2 books I would highly recommend if someone could read. One is called The Maladies of Empire by Jim Downs. It's essentially about how colonialism, slavery, and war transformed medicine. And the other one is Colonial Pathologies by Warwick Anderson. And basically what these books try and explain is how the international health system today, or the aid system, is so rooted in tropical medicine. By the way, I have a specialization in tropical medicine, so this is very much, it hits very close to home for me. And then, of course, this is how you get the modern idea that global health is merely about infectious diseases, perhaps in other countries. And in many ways, it's also demonstrated in the way global health programming is done, which is largely driven through global health security agenda. And then, of course, it's overlapped with aid and the development industries. This is an interesting cartoon from the magazine called Tropical Life in 1913. And now on the left it says this London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Fund. So that's my alma mater, the school I went to. And on the right, you can see the depiction of someone who traveled to these faraway lands and fell sick because of a mosquito bite. And yeah, so this concept of focusing on the health of those who were serving the empire, that's how the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was established. That's how the funding developed, the funding streams developed, and of course, after decolonization, those were the exact same structures which remained. Now, quickly, after colonialism, a very small thought experiment. Now, imagine, you must have all played Monopoly. So imagine you're playing Monopoly, and one player is given all the property except Whitechapel Road, perhaps. They're also given 95% of the bank. What do you expect? How long will the game last? It would probably be a very, very short game. Why? Because of this capital accumulation, one person has all the cards on the table. They're very easily able to win. But then, of course, what's the justification of suggesting that why did you lose? It's probably because you were lazy. It's probably because you didn't want to work. Now, the reason I bring this up here is immediately after independence, the very fact that you want to now measure countries immediately suggesting that there were no colonial depredations, there was no historical extraction, and now everyone is forced to compete within the same open market. From a neoliberal perspective, if you have started very weak in the system of a neoliberal enterprise, of course you are going to be at a loss. You are going to be one of those people who has less than 5% of the global resources and the global bank. It's not a fair game. It's never going to be a fair game. And to expect that those systems continue without having reparations, fair reparations, in the same way and produce exactly the systems which have been replicated in Europe and North America, that's unfair, right? That's the point here that I want to really get across. So neoliberalism is a policy model that encompasses both politics and economics and seeks to transfer the control of economic factors from public sector to the private sector. Not my favorite definition of neoliberalism, however, this one is. So neoliberalism is the extremist ideology which states that greed is always good, even when it does evil, that the private sector is always efficient, even when it is not, and the public sector is never efficient, even when it is. The government, therefore, should never intervene in the economy, even when it should, because wealth will trickle down, and a rising tide will enrich us all, even though it won't. All thanks to an invisible hand which does not exist. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, when you have this disproportionate disparity of wealth, power, resources, and you let it all loose in a global free market, neoliberal, capitalistic enterprise, of course there's going to be by default neocolonial extractions. So neocolonialism, what is neocolonialism? Neocolonialism is essentially this term that came into existence after the Second World War, and it's basically relates to how the post-colonial countries still rely on former colonies, and they continue to be exploited and extracted in the process. And such exploitation basically imitates the unfair policies and disproportionate distribution of resources and power without the expense of militarization exception. So basically, this is not that the colonizers are there physically, but much rather this is a form of economic colonialism. And the system is geared by transnational corporations, global organizations, multilateral corporations, and further facilitated by capitalism, allowing powerful nations to dominate and subject nations by use of economic oppression rather than a direct rule. So you don't need to be physically present there, but you have neo-colonialistic cronies who do the bidding for you in the global south countries, who extract all the wealth, liberalize the local economies, allow corporations to come in, do the extraction, do the mining, steal all the mineral wealth, which ends up continents like Africa being the largest producers of raw material in the world, but at the same time one of the least paid. Why? Because Africa is essentially a producer of raw material, and that's it. All the manufacturing gets done in other parts of the world, and then they end up being consumers. Then once all of this economic produce is pushed down your throat, of course you're going to end up losing. A very interesting cartoon by polyp.org.uk. So colonialism was essentially, I claim this land in the name of His Majesty, and neo-colonialism is IMF coming in. I structurally adjust this land in the name of economic growth. Another cartoon by Eurocentric Confessions, which shows basically the comparison of how we look at apartheid South Africa versus refusing or failing to see that global apartheid is a thing, and that IMF, World Bank are able to do this so much better, like a class act. Multilateralism and the debt trap. So the reason multilateralism grew after the Second World War, of course, on paper it had tremendous ambitions and goals. They wanted to be this ambition that we reduce inequality, leave no one behind, improve health and well-being for everyone. There's the Alma Ata, which is the Universal Declaration of Health for All. There is this ambition to build and promote peace, security, and justice. However, in reality, multilateralism has failed spectacularly. I touched on this a bit yesterday, but by and large, multilateralism has not lived up to its expectations or its ambitions. Large organizations like the UN agencies are very much nearly impossible to reform. And if you talk about states, they will rather opt for more pragmatic approaches rather than approaches which would lie in solidarity with others. One ambition of the multilateral entities like the UN and the Security Council was to maintain peace in the world. I don't see it. If anything, the Security Council has been an impediment to peace with these 5 countries who have this veto power. It's essentially one's proxy versus another, and you end up using that power not for the benefit of the world, unfortunately. So what has happened in this last 30, 40 years is that the power was shifted to entities like the World Bank, these multilateral entities. And these banks begin to start lending money for health services, which is basically indebting the countries, expecting that the health services would improve. And then health financing under structural adjustment. So debt relief was conditional based off of structural readjustment. And then the state services were somewhat reduced, and then that led to the introduction of more private healthcare, more out-of-pocket costs, more user fee, or the gaps were filled in by NGOs and INGOs. This is a depiction of Nestle powdered milk from India in the 1980s. So there has been a global boycott campaign mounted against Nestle since 1977. Nestle has been responsible for deaths of more children in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia than any other single entity. Why? For multiple reasons. One of them is because they used bribery as a method to push these formula milks within these societies. What ended up happening was that mothers would then use unsanitary water mixed with this formula milk, feed it to children. The children do not have immunity. They would end up with extensive gastrointestinal diseases, and they would die. Also, recently, Nestle was again in the news for not good reasons. It was demonstrated that Nestle, within its African and Indian markets, introduced a huge amount of sugar, which would eventually at some point lead to obesity within these children. So on the image on the right, if you see, this is the countries which are neither healthy nor wealthy. So what the graph shows is basically the proportion of debt servicing that these countries have to do as opposed to their healthcare spending. So if you look at Mozambique, for example, it's almost 8 or 9 times the amount of money they have to spend in debt servicing versus the amount of money they spend on their local health system. Same for DRC, it's almost 7 times. Gambia, 6.5 times, or almost 6.7 times, and so on and so forth. So just imagine the amount of debt servicing that these countries have to do versus the amount of money that they are spending on the healthcare of their people. On the left, you can see, this was a very interesting piece that's of course written as an opinion, but it was a thoroughly researched piece, which shows some estimates that the rich countries drained nearly $152 trillion from the global south since the 1960s, which is a spectacular figure if you think about it. And in the very next slide, you see that as compared to 152 trillion, a measly 13 trillion, which was actually owed to the global south by rich countries, was not even paid. It was pledged but never paid. And of course, this was highlighted by the British charity Oxfam. If you look at this slide, you can see that the new colonial net wealth extraction from the global south amounts to nearly 2 trillion USD annually. And this is, of course, not something which is an opinion. This is thoroughly documented in this report, which is Financial Flows in Tax Havens. And yeah, you can see how since the 1980s, the situation has only become worse, and that the wealth extraction continues to increase over time. On the left, you can see the biggest facilitators of global tax abuse. Of course, when we talk about tax abuse, this is the amount of money which is stolen from the global south countries and their corrupt leaders, and it is hosted in countries like the UK, Netherlands, Luxembourg, US, Switzerland, all of these places with banking laws which prevent these global south countries to get back the stolen wealth which was stolen from those countries. On the right, this is from the Tax Justice Network. You can see that the total tax losses to tax havens annually is around, it's almost $500 billion. And it's the rich countries, not palm-fringed islands, which are responsible for most of the global tax abuse. 55% is actually UK, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, which is called the axis of tax avoidance, just because we want to make access out of everything. Next topic that I'll just briefly touch is something I like to call, at least, passport coloniality. A small depiction of a refugee ship which was caught by the British. The banner reads that the Germans destroyed our families. Please don't you destroy our hopes. Of course, this is a ship full of Jewish refugees who arrives in Palestine prior to 1948 under the Aliyah Bet program, and of course this picture is courtesy of Israel Forever Foundation. Now, the reason I put the slide up there, I just want to compare and contrast it to this particular cartoon, where you can see on one side it's the Ukrainian refugees, and on the other side it's the Syrian or the Palestinian refugees. And you can see what the positioning of the European Union is when it comes to the two kinds of, or two different sets of refugees. This was a report by Chatham House which says that Ukraine exposes Europe's double standards for refugees. There is certainly a double standard for refugees. I'm not saying it, neither am I suggesting it. It's thoroughly documented by one of the biggest think tanks out there. It's called the Chatham House. This image depicts 15 years of Fortress Europe. The red hot spots are essentially every single death that has taken place of refugees and migrants in the so-called journey into Europe. As you can see, most of the deaths have taken place in North Africa and in the Mediterranean. And just in the first half of 2016, almost 2,500 people died trying to reach Europe, and those are statistics from the IOM, International Office of Migration. A small snippet of how all of this unequal society, if you end up with training that computer algorithm which does not know any better, but because that's the existing norm out there, what that may result in for the future, where power keeps concentrating within a few versus at the disposition of the many. A small thing I would like to discuss again, climate coloniality. So this is a picture from a place which I think I am much more authorized to talk about, even though I'm not an expert on the subject, but because I lived through this. This was in 2020, where the city where I lived, Karachi, which is, in terms of population, is nearly 35 million people, which is 7 times the size of Finland, experienced almost a flooding so big that multiple people died in it. And this was just in 2020. In 2022, a much bigger flood, a flood that was so big that a third of the country was drowned underwater. And this flooding could actually be seen from space. And I was deployed by MSF in some parts of the region where I led teams to provide this humanitarian aid and health, because the entire cities were drowned, healthcare system was destroyed. And after my 3 months there, when I came back, people would often ask me, why was this such a big flood? And then I would try to explain to them that this is what happens when you have climate change and exceptional flooding coupled with an over-engineered irrigation system. So the engineering of the irrigation system within this part of the world started almost 150 years ago by the British, where what they tried to do was reorient the waterways, the rivers, towards the deserts, and trying to reclaim those deserts and make them much more functional. So what ends up happening is, if you imagine a big river to be like a big artery versus the small canals to be like the capillaries, you end up with a much larger surface area. And when that surface area overflows, it ends up overflowing over a larger surface area as opposed to if the river was not engineered. So because of this, some estimates suggested that it was a cumulative loss of $6 trillion of life and land within the region. If you look at it from a global sense, this is a tweet from Jason Hickel, which says that the tragedy in Pakistan is a stark reminder of climate injustice. The top map shows which nations are most responsible for excess emissions, and the bottom map shows which nations are most impacted by it. Climate breakdown is playing out along colonial lines. So, the overshoot of emissions, which is according to Lancet Planetary Health, if you look at it, it is mostly Russia, Western Europe, and North America, which have historically been the largest producers of carbon emissions. However, the impact is mostly in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Africa. Also to some extent, South America. And then you'd be like, but do we have a mechanism for it? Just quickly, just to remind you that from a climate perspective, Pakistan actually became the first country to exceed the Bond challenge, which was planting 1 billion trees. This was in 2017. So despite the fact that a country makes an effort to be climate responsible, plants 1 billion trees, still ends up being the country which is the most impacted by the climate change. Ends up with a $6 trillion loss, and less than $500 billion ends up being paid as loss and damage to recovery. Now, this is a graph by our World in Data. It basically shows historically since the 1800s what the standing of US and Canada, for example, is as opposed to India and Pakistan. So if you look at it, these are the historical carbon dioxide emissions per capita. So as you can see that US, Canada, UK have throughout history, if you look at it from a historical perspective, have been responsible for most of the carbon dioxide production. However, today what we want to suggest is that let's all start history from 2020 or 2025 so that we are able to pay as much to the loss and damage fund as just anyone else. These are cumulative CO2 emissions historically. You can see US has exceeded 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide production. And if you compare it to other global south countries and the fact that we hold them to the same standard as we do to the US, I mean, it's just not fair. If we think about the principle of retrograde carbon taxing, the ones who have historically been responsible for producing most carbon dioxide should be the ones who should have the biggest share in loss and damage and climate reparations. A depiction of the paradox of an environmental activist working in an international NGO, trying to save the world and wildlife. This is from Rash Brax, who used to work in the MSF France office, a guy I really admire, and I'll show some of his cartoons later as well. He has an amazing take on humanitarianism as well. Again, some cartoons. So if you look at the inequality that exists in the world, the fact that, of course, this is nothing against not wanting to protest, but at the same time, one has to be cognizant of the fact that still being able to go to school is so much of a privilege, as opposed to entire schools being drowned and destroyed in the global south. And yeah, another humorous depiction of once you're given these loss and damage funds, that thank you, but you also have resilient funds to undo 200 years of imperial injustice. All of this is from Green Humor. A very interesting book, again, by Laurie Parsons, which is about carbon colonialism. It basically goes more into the depth about how rich countries end up exporting climate breakdown to the global south. So the reason I mentioned climate as an important part of it, because in most of the places where humanitarian organizations work and organizations like MSF work, that is one of the biggest reasons for us to work there, is the impacts of these climate change related natural disasters, and how we are the ones who end up holding the bag, as well as the global south countries and economies, whilst the countries who have historically produced most of the carbon dioxide are the ones who continue to shrug responsibility, which is a very good segue into the USAID funding cuts. So not only are they shrugging responsibility from historically the amount of carbon dioxide that was produced, but also the little that went into the global health system has been cut off. This is from Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. This basically shows the global direct development assistance for health flows across the world. On the left are the countries which are giving aid. In between are the agencies, all the multilaterals through which that aid is channelized. And then on the right are the healthcare thematic areas where the money ends up going. So if you look at United States, it was by far the biggest donor to the global health infrastructure, which ended up giving nearly 20 to 25% of all global health aid to the healthcare infrastructure. And what is in between? It again says United States, it's basically USAID. So this is because most of the USAID funding was channeled bilaterally through USAID. So you can see that most of that funding, because of the USAID funding cuts, will no longer be there, which means essentially a fifth or a quarter of all of global health funding. So if you look in the on the left side of the graph, it basically shows the proportion of US bilateral global health assistance as a percentage of domestic spending. So Afghanistan, for example, the amount of money that it spent on its local healthcare system, almost 3.5 times that amount of money came from the USAID funding. Similarly, for Somalia, South Sudan, over twice as much of the funding for the local health system came from the USAID funding, then from the domestic resources. And of course, these are some of the poorest countries in the world and some of the most fragile health systems in the world. And now, without this important global health funding, we don't know what the impacts would potentially be. It's yet to be seen. On the right is the sector which had to suffer the most. So most of the money that was cut was within protection assistance, and then followed by macroeconomic foundation for growth, and then HIV/AIDS, agriculture, etc. So this is, of course, somewhat of an exhaustive list, but the actual impact of these funding cuts is going to be far greater than what we can depict on graphs. And I give an example that even if, let's say, there are drugs secured for nearly a year or 6 months as a measure of buffer stock or security stock, if you don't have the funding for the HR or people to transport it, or you don't have a transport budget, those drugs sitting in those warehouses are useless, because we had built a system which was so much dependent on such a long, robust supply chains that if you break any part of that cycle, the system ends up not functioning. So the indirect impact of all of these aid cuts is going to be far greater. And of course, it's just not US aid, it's other European countries as well, unfortunately. It includes Britain, which has reduced its ODA spending from 0.5 to 0.3. Germany has put in aid cuts. Netherlands, Sweden already did it end of last year. So it's a recurrent theme, and not only will it perpetuate the global inequalities that we've been talking about, all of it is going to end up in a much more unequal world. An example of a coloniality of global health in the recent past was, of course, we all remember what happened during COVID-19. What was essentially a disease which had broken out throughout the world was potentially an opportunity for solidarity, because diseases know no borders, especially COVID, became a peak of neocolonialism, and it was depicted very much so throughout the 2.5 years that we witnessed this disease run rampant throughout the world. Rich countries ended up buying most of the medical supplies, leaving poor countries stranded. So there was a rat race for supplies, for drugs, for PPE, for vaccines eventually. These are just some newspaper clippings depicting what happened. US, of course, whoever was able to pay the most premium ended up hoarding most of the stocks. The only limited evidence of a drug, which was remdesivir, which was historically an Ebola medicine, was hoarded by the US after it was shown to be efficacious. COVAX, which was a mechanism developed by WHO for vaccine distribution throughout the world, that vaccine hoarding ended up creating large degrees of inequalities within the countries who had access to vaccines and who did not. Nick Dearden, one of my good friends from the UK, I mean, he wrote this article. He also recently published this book. I should have put it in there as well. The book's name is Pharmaconomics, and basically it explains the ills and the problems of the global health, the pharmaceutical industry, and how it functions. And in this piece that he wrote in 2021, it was very clear that it's system change that is needed, not charity, which will eventually end the vaccine apartheid. Okay. So this is a very good segue into my next part of the presentation, which is about Doctors Without Borders. And the reason I wanted to lay that entire background, which was for 40 minutes, was just to suggest that no one functions in isolation. We are all a product of our lived experiences, and the organizations that exist are also a product of their times and a product of what came about as a natural evolution of society within those places. So just a few disclosures and disclaimers before I begin. The executive director of MSF, Finland, is here. In no way, shape, or form do I represent the official position of MSF in this talk. This is entirely based off of my lived experience within the organization. And I may be wrong, I may be absolutely wrong. However, that still doesn't change the fact that this was my lived experience, and I'm entitled to it, and I'm entitled to present it. And it is for the audience to judge and decide if at any point what I suggest makes no sense. And it could very well be possible that I may be absolutely wrong, and that's not the reality. But however, as a very small student of life, it's my responsibility to document and see, to document what I've seen. So, and this is not to say that I love MSF. I still continue to work for MSF. It's one of the best organizations there is in the world, hands down. I started working for MSF in 2017. I continue to work for it to this day. And I hopefully, even after this presentation and when I return to Juba, I continue to work for it. Just a quick history of MSF. So MSF was established in 1971. It broke away from ICRC on the principle of neutrality. So basically, the idea behind MSF's creation was the principle of témoignage, which is speaking out. So when we see something in a conflict, historical position for ICRC was that you have to be neutral, impartial, look at both sides of the story, do not take sides in the situation. And MSF ethos was fundamentally different. They were like, we will continue to be impartial when it comes to seeing patients. So regardless of which side of the conflict the patients come to us, we will treat them, we will remain impartial, but we will not be neutral. Neutrality is only a tool, a principle, but when it comes to speaking out, we are going to speak out on behalf of the dispossessed that we see. So this fundamental disagreement led to the creation of MSF after the Biafra crisis in Nigeria. And 15 doctors and journalists ended up creating MSF. This is a small timeline of what went on later on those years. As you can see, in 1979, the war in Afghanistan started. There was 1976, there was a war in Lebanon, and MSF ended up being in all of those places. This is the timeline between the 1981 and 1985. Of course, in 1984, there was this huge famine in Ethiopia, and MSF continued to provide care. On the side, it's also what in timeline was something relative. So in 1985 was when the first mobile call was made. So this is just to suggest how old MSF is as an entity. Civil war in Sri Lanka, earthquake in Armenia, Iraq war, Then the civil war in Liberia, MSF was there in every single conflict. There was emergency in Kurdistan. There was the Bosnian, the Srebrenica genocide, and then the Rwanda genocide, followed by a very, very difficult time, including for MSF, which eventually led to 1999. This is where MSF won the Nobel Peace Prize. And because MSF was an associative entity and it ended up getting this $1 million, there was a discussion about what should we do with it. So what the organization at that point decided or agreed on was to create two entities from this money. One was the MSF Access campaign, which would globally fight against the lack of access to pharmaceutical products globally, and the other one was the DNDI, which is Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. Both of these were created as semi-autonomous entities, which would continue to run. DNDI's job would be to do drug research and development for the neglected diseases. Why? Because the large pharmaceutical companies in the world would just not have enough of a financial incentive to do research and development within drugs for these neglected diseases. Then we have in 2005 the big tsunami in Asia. At this point in time, MSF also made a public appeal and ended up generating more money that it could spend. And this was one of the first times in history where an organization said, please, we don't want to generate more funds. Can we return back your money? We already have generated more money than we can spend. So yeah, I mean, many first times for MSF. Then there was, of course, the ongoing war in Syria. MSF ended up setting up large numbers of projects there, including some in Amman, Jordan, including a fully functional reconstructive surgery hospital, and the conflicts in Gaza continued, earthquake in Haiti, and all of those places MSF was instrumental. Then in 2014 there was the massive Ebola outbreak, in which of course MSF was there, made a name out of itself. If it wasn't for MSF and the local ministries of health, we don't know where the world would be today. In 2015, one of our biggest trauma centers in Kunduz, Afghanistan, was bombed by the US military forces. That was one of the biggest attacks that MSF had ever faced. 42 people were killed and 14 of them were MSF staff. As a direct result of that bombing, of course, MSF took to the UN Security Council to request an independent investigation into the incident. And there's a famous story of how MSF international president refused a phone call from President Obama. She was like, we're not having any discussions before you agree to an independent investigation. And then, of course, takes us all the way down to 2020, and when there's this massive COVID outbreak, and MSF ends up setting up responses not just in the global south at this point, but also in the global north. We set up programs in the US, for example, in France, in Belgium, in places across the migrant corridor, and in Europe. And yeah, all of that was a spectacular job done by MSF. Now moving on to the not so good parts about MSF. This is just a very small depiction of how we historically did fundraising. Linda is not impressed, but so if you can see, there's a toy of an emaciated black child, and the doctor is this white guy in a white vehicle with a logo and everything. Just a small example of course, we don't do fundraising like that anymore, but as an organization which was a product of its time, this was very normal. This is a cartoon I usually show in this talk, just to suggest that how aid has evolved over time. So again, this cartoon is by Rash Brax, which is one of my favorite cartoonists. It was hosted by MSF France. He here depicts how historically there was a close proximity to the patients and communities, and eventually, if you look at 2010s, the aid industrial complex ends up being so big and so massive with big bureaucracies and overheads that there's a lot of securitization. The international staff are behind their exorbitant compounds, fortresses, and basically what Rash here is trying to hypothesize is what will happen later, what will happen in the 2030s. Will we just be using drones to deliver drugs? I mean, does that become the end utilitarian end function of a humanitarian aid organization, devoid of any form of human contact with the communities, the patients that we once used to be so close to? So again, something to think about. Of course, how the massive global bureaucracy that has evolved. I apologize, this one is in French, but on the left you can say l'industrie humanitaire, which means the humanitarian industry, and this is the NGO terrain, which is the NGO field worker, which is the donkey. And you can see all of the work is done by the humanitarian aid workers in the projects in the field, but most of the credit is taken by all of the big bureaucrats, which is the OSHAs, the PAMs, the diplomats, the ECHOs, consultants, etc. Also true to some extent for MSF HQs, but yeah. This is just a depiction of this concept of sending in international staff for extremely short periods of time into countries which have who have long-standing capacities. Not to say that I am against this or that I condone this. It's just a form of an expression by a third person who is sitting in the HQ and he's looking at it and he's like, you know, this ambitious young doctor from Europe has come in and he's come to revolutionize the treatment of malaria. And the local doctor is like, you know, there's quite a few like those that come in every 3 months, so don't worry about it. Let's get on with business. Now, so this is only to suggest as well that while myself being an international staff, we end up taking most of the credit for the work that is done. It is essentially our national staff which are the backbone of MSF throughout the world. They are the ones who do the day-to-day, maintain operations. Even when we are evacuated from the region, they continue with the operations in extremely dire circumstances with difficult security. Why? Because they are there within the community. They are perhaps more MSF than I am. They continue to stick with the communities even when the going gets tough. And then this is just a depiction of the entirety of how organizations become so big that it becomes all about the brand and the brand management. So the institution or the logo is at the center of all of the brand comms, whereas the patient takes a back seat, or the communities take a back seat. This was one instance where again I developed so much more love and respect for MSF as an institution, because it was all about the principle. The principle was that MSF rejected nearly 2.3 billion euros of funding from the EU because of the fact that EU had struck a deal with Turkey that any of the migrants that traveled from Turkey on dinghy boats to mainland Europe would be returned to Turkey. And because of that, MSF took a very principled position and refused that aid, which, at least in my book, was something spectacular to do, and something that is only done when you have strong principles and you prioritize principles over this neoliberal concept of fundraising. But at the same time, there are other parts of MSF, not necessarily within the same places, that just really, put a system. It's like one of our offices in the global north who have, I will not name which one, but who have a very different understanding of neoliberal economics, decided to accept donation from BlackRock as if it was not an issue. But here's the problem. BlackRock has trillions of dollars of worth of investments in arms, the same arms which end up hurting and dispossessing our patients that we are essentially treating within Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, the drone strikes, the drone producers, manufacturers, all of that backed by BlackRock funding. So it's like the cognitive dissonance of being able to accept that money and not linking it to the political economy that sits behind that act, and that hurts the people that we try to serve. Again, it was 5 trillion at the time when I made this presentation some years ago. It's now 10 trillion actually. This is a small matrix of MSF HR workforce globally. So MSF by far is the world's biggest medical humanitarian organization with a total of over 65,000 staff globally. Where do these staff come from? You can have a look. So most of the MSF staff actually come from the African continent. That's where MSF staff comes from. A smaller proportion come from the Middle East. And where in the Middle East? Mostly from Yemen, Syria, Iraq. And then a smaller proportion from Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Burma, India. And then comes staff from Europe. However, when historically you would have seen MSF imagery or MSF comms, you would have seen something much different in terms of who is depicted and how they're depicted. However, when it comes to voting rights in MSF, this is how they are. So this is the staff in MSF, and this is the voting rights in MSF. So it's essentially largely driven by European decision making, by European seats that we have on the boards, and of course these are dedicated votes. Now, some may say that this is primarily driven by who does most fundraising, but even that's not the principle, because a third of our funding comes from our USA office, and they end up also with 2 votes, the exact same number of votes that Luxembourg has, or MSF Norway or MSF Finland have. No, you don't have votes. Sorry, apologies. Norway has votes. Next, we move on to organizing without borders. So, based off of that, again, now this is just purely my lived experience inside the organization. We ended up creating in one of the largest behemoths of organizations a small movement in order to try and reform it, and I'll just walk you through it quickly as to what it was. I'll just share brief details with you, and then of course we can have a discussion about it later. So this is me having a debate with the MSF International President in 2020. Immediately after that, I ended up setting up a WhatsApp group. It started from a small group of people, which basically escalated. We ended up writing a call to action and an open letter, which was basically that, which focused on three things, which was again a call from the bottom of the institution, which was not very different from a call which was from the top ends of the institutions, that we have to focus on a governance reform inside MSF, change the way we vote and think and govern the organization, change the way we treat our national staff inside MSF, including some rights, privileges, accesses that they have. And then the third call was to do much more patient-centered care, to look at patients and communities as the be-all, as the center of our operations, not just merely numbers that we report in our annual reports, So focusing more on quality care that I would like to receive as well if I am within that setting, rather than have a different level of care for myself versus the patients. For some odd reason, this became a global viral sensation. It was published, it ended up being published in The Guardian, and then within 20 other newspapers across the world in 6 different languages. Now, of course, when we wrote the open letter, we had no idea that it is going to travel continents, be translated into multiple languages, end up being picked up by multiple news outlets, but it apparently happened. There was this entire, there was news clippings from Al Jazeera, there was news clippings from many other sources. I'll take you through them in a bit. This was another flaw that we saw in the system, where we did not have enough safeguarding for patients within vulnerable positions, and that was certainly a huge part of the problem, at least for myself and few of my like-minded colleagues. And again, there was another round of holding MSF to account to make sure that there is enough resources invested which actively try to filter through these huge archives of photographs that we had that depicted patients in compromised positions. And yeah, getting rid of all of that. If we had to buy back copyrights from photographers who had come to our facilities, taken pictures, so be it. We don't care how much that would cost, but it's a part of simple biomedical ethics, and that should have not happened. Of course, holding to account some of the fundraising sections as well. In the process, we ended up collecting over 80 to 90 pages of testimonies from MSF colleagues around the world who who read the open letter, who put in their thoughts, who put down their experiences within the institution. Some of those testimonies were converted into artwork that we actually ended up printing and hanging in a few of our offices as well. And then, of course, there was a lot of interest from outside journalists to see what went on inside MSF. A few investigative pieces came out from Reveal. This one was from Foreign Policy. So not only because it became so viral, it ended up with a reckoning not just within MSF, but within the entire international aid sector. So I remember a time when I started receiving calls from folks inside ICRC, from International Medica Corps, from Peace Corps. And they were like, how do we try and use the same systems and mechanisms to organize as well? And yeah, that was considered to be the second coming of the Aid 2 movement. Goats and soda. It eventually took MSF some time, but this was addressed by the leadership. They did put out a form of a piece of writing suggesting that they are going to take steps. Of course, it's been 5 years now. How many of those changes have taken place? It's still a question mark, it's a debate. But the good thing is at least it started this debate internally and this push to change, which would have otherwise not had happened. This is, of all places, this is from the House of Commons and the International Development Committee, which ended up quoting Decolonize MSF in its investigation into the aid sector and this accusation of racism within the aid sector. So, of course, this was not just focused on MSF, but within the entire aid sector, led by the Select Committee. But to be quoted in it, it's still something. I don't know, maybe. MSF itself commissioned power analysis research within the institution because we are such a big and such a complex institution. It did need some form of objective research to come into the institution and study it. And of course, it's not always easy. We are not one organization. We are fragments of multiple organizations banded together as one. The other thing is there's limited access given to the researchers as well. So there were quite a few limitations, but it did come up with a very powerful piece of work which was institutionally commissioned. The report is there, you can have a look as well. But in all of this work and trying to figure out retrospectively what went on with MSF as an institution, I came across this amazing book which is called Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism. And in it explains how the idea of sovereignty of the market was pushed throughout the 70s and the 80s, and this concept of neoliberal human rights and racialized discourse. So even though these, so most of it was driven by theorists like von Mises, but what it suggested was that let there be no overt racism, but much rather that post-colonial poverty is largely self-inflicted, and that these countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world are mostly in this position because of poor governance, corruption, etc., without including the idea of the historical depredations and the historical extraction and the neo-colonial extraction which had taken place. And this was also true for MSF. So MSF in the 80s did adopt this idea of neoliberal economic thinking, explicitly opposing post-colonial demands for global redistribution and aligning with economists like Peter Bauer, suggesting that only competitive market economies could safeguard human rights. And MSF leadership also repudiated, and this was in the 70s and the 80s, these arguments from anti-colonial thinkers like Fanon and Sartre, denying any causal link between Europe's wealth and the impoverishment of former colonies, and framed such claims as harmful colonial guilt. So when you refuse that part and you just walk down the path of pure neoliberalism driven fundraising to do operations, and do operations in a manner which is not necessarily taking into account the local health system structures, you end up with such a powerful beast of an institution which is 2.7 billion euros annual and is expanded over 72 countries with over 65,000 staff. So of course, a lot of this, I mean, it certainly can be rationalized, but that's just one step of the process. What it needs now for the MSF leadership is to get back to the drawing board, sit down and try to shift the dial on how we understand humanitarianism and global aid. And if I was to leave you with something, it would be on the left, there is this pyramid of the current global health structure, which is where the fundamental base is the colonialism, the structural racism. It is driven by philanthrocapitalism and the Western Eurocentric ideas of global health and the power imbalances, which leads to humanitarians privileging Western institutions, Western technology, Western academia. They'd always be the first authors. There would virtually be none from the global south. And all of that leads to this global inequality. As opposed to that, what a potentially decolonized global health structure would look like would be equitable distribution of power away from European, North American contexts to other contexts, power in the hands of the people and the priority setting to be done by the global majority rather than those people who hold most of the wealth and resources, or those who happen to be in close proximity to where all the resources are. And then this reconceptualization, actualization of humanitarianism as equal partners and not just necessarily as givers and takers, donors of aid, recipients of aid, but merely as co-creators, co-implementers, as an equal partnership with the local stakeholders, local communities, local ministries of health. And that would eventually lead to the global equity, justice, and the large-scale environmental protection that we talk about, which will eventually impact us all. Is it possible? Because that was the question. I don't know the answer, but I'll leave it for you guys to discuss. Thank you.